The Ukrainian counteroffensive has been going on since June. Ever since then, we've been hearing vastly different things from both sides. According to the pro-Russian crowd, the Ukrainian counteroffensive has been a complete failure, Western weapons are ineffective, and the Russian lines keep holding. According to the pro-Ukrainian cheerleaders, the Ukrainian counteroffensive is going exactly according to plan, and the Russian lines are 2 days away from complete collapse. But in this case, both extremes are wrong. In this video, I'll be talking about the following: the description of the basic situation, the problems Russia and Ukraine are facing, the current status of the counteroffensive, a word on pro-Russian quote-unquote peace advocates, a rough outlook into the future in terms of how and when the war could end, and accounts you should and shouldn't follow for accurate coverage. And I'll be doing all this in the Perun format because it's the most practical. You should definitely subscribe to Perun, by the way, the link to his channel is in the description. So let's get started. But first, I'd like to thank Conflict of Nations for sponsoring today's video. Conflict of Nations is a free, online, player versus player strategy game where you get to choose a real country to lead during World War III. You can battle up to 128 players in games that can last up to multiple weeks. Use a wide array of military units, ranging from tanks, jets to nuclear submarines, declare war on other players, or forge alliances with them, engage in battles, and craft your own strategy to take over the world. Conflict of Nations is playable both on PC and mobile with the same account. Click my link in the description and get 13,000 gold and 1 month of premium subscription for free. The offer is available for 30 days only, so don't waste time. Thank you once again for Conflict of Nations for sponsoring today's video. And now, back to the program. So let's start with the basic summary of the situation in Ukraine. How goes the counteroffensive? I believe we can all see by now that this isn't Kharkiv or the first weeks of the invasion. This is like Kherson, but much worse. There are no quick gains or astounding successes, just a slow, bloody grind through Russian lines, one trench at a time. These aren't your hastily dug trenches either, like in the beginning. These are formidable, more or less well-built fortifications where soldiers can often survive even a direct hit from artillery. These trenches were built in the framework of the original Surovikin plan. Build out fortifications, wait out the winter while reconstituting, let Ukrainians crash against defenses, then attack them once exhausted. This was the plan for the winter, but Russian political machinations forced an attack instead. They took Bakhmut at an almost catastrophic cost and ground themselves down at Vuhledar. The result is an exhausted Russian army and reconstituted Ukrainian forces, the opposite of what Surovikin wanted. But the defenses are still there and formidable. Bad Russian decision-making did not win the war for Ukrainians, it only gave them an advantage. But Ukraine is also in a time press. The ground is maneuverable till October, when the Rasputica hits, meaning, as of the making of this video, they have about 2 months for maneuvering high-intensity combat. As a disclaimer though, I'd like to stress that we do not know what the Ukrainian plans are. We can only speculate and extrapolate, but in the meantime, only the Ukrainian leadership knows what they can and want to achieve and when. Please keep this in mind as we go along. And now let's take a look at factors like what each side is doing and the problems they are facing. First, the Ukrainians. You might have noticed that despite the cheerleaders' insistence, the counteroffensive did not start out as well as expected. Before its official start, there was a large social media campaign by Ukraine which made it seem like they will break through Russian defenses and be at the Sea of Azov in about a month. But Russian defenses proved far harder to crack than expected. We all remember that blown-out column of Bradleys, which Russian propaganda took thousands of pictures of from every possible angle, and kept spamming them in social media for weeks. That was a failed Ukrainian attempt at breaking through a Russian defensive line. But thankfully, that was the last of such an occasion. Ukrainian command quickly realized that they won't break through Russian lines head-on, so they adapted. Now, instead of head-on mechanized assaults, they use artillery to soften up Russian defenses and HIMARS to interdict Russian supplies. Blowing up the Kerch Bridge yet again was part of this strategy. With this, the Ukrainians are chipping away at Russian-held territory, bit by bit, slowly making progress. As for Ukrainians' problems, the first is the usual suspect, the lack of shells. This problem is being remedied, but it takes time to ramp up production and establish supply lines. Still, we have come a long way since last year, where Ukrainian shell stocks were at catastrophic levels. Another problem, a reason for Ukraine's slow progress, is the lack of experience in large-scale, combined arms maneuvers. This is pretty much the most difficult thing an army can do, and Ukrainians have to learn it in a few months while they are actively at war. Consequently, they opted for an artillery-supported incremental advance instead. Alright, you might say, but does NATO doctrine and training help? Yes and no. It does help, in the sense that the troops did get NATO training and are using more and more NATO standard vehicles and equipment. And it does not help, in the sense that they only got basic, shortened NATO training. In addition, when breaching defensive lines, while large-scale combined arms maneuvers are difficult enough to pull off, NATO doctrine also assumes air supremacy as a basic prerequisite, which is in the case here. The airspace is contested, and Russian Ka-52 helicopters can freely lob anti-tank guided missiles at advancing Ukrainian columns from well outside air defense range. This problem cannot be solved simply by having a Gepard short-range anti-air gun accompanying troops, despite what certain build journalists on Twitter would want you to believe. The overarching issue Ukrainians are facing is that the Russian military excels in so-called defense in depth. If there is one thing they can do extremely well, it's this. Russians have multiple defensive lines for 30, 40, 50 kilometers in depth, and they are not about to give them up without a fight. So how does Western equipment factor into this? They do help and are very important, but the main, most important form of aid remains artillery shells. That being said, Western equipment such as Bradleys and Leopards tend to arrive in delayed shipments in smaller than needed quantities. The stuff Ukraine is getting now has been agreed upon last year. In December 2022, Zaluzhny said that he needed 300 tanks, 700 infantry fighting vehicles, and 500 howitzers in order to get back to the 23rd of February borders. Not Crimea, not the Donbass, the 23rd of February borders. In contrast, at the time of recording, Ukraine received around 60 Leopard 2s and 14 Challengers, so 74 modern tanks, in addition to 40 Marders, and the 154 Bradleys, so 194 modern IFVs. So by the time of the counteroffensive, Ukraine received about a fourth of what's needed as a bare minimum. And we haven't even talked about things like F-16 jets. Ukraine will be able to deploy those in 2024 at best, meanwhile they needed them already in June 2023. With all that said, how is Russia faring along? Stopping the counteroffensive is the task of the Russian land forces, who, according to estimates, have lost 40 to 50% of their personnel to death or injury through the war's 17 months. So the Ukrainian counteroffensive is faced off by a heavily attrited Russian military. However, despite their attrition, there are still a lot of them in Ukraine, with their fortifications acting as a force multiplier. On the other hand, Russian equipment losses have been and continue to be somewhere between catastrophic and severe as they continue to speedrun the destruction of their Soviet heritage. Currently, Russia's visually confirmed losses stand at 11,533, of which 2,199 are tanks, 938 armored fighting vehicles, 2,616 IFVs, 339 APCs, and 139 IMVs. All this is to say, Russia won't be conducting maneuver-based defense. Their current task is to hold the lines at all costs and try to attrite Ukrainian attackers. And they do this with varying degrees of success. As of the making of this video, Ukrainians have managed to take over the first preliminary Russian trench lines north of Tokmak and are gradually progressing south. They have yet to reach the main Russian lines, which will be the true test for both sides. The challenge Russia is facing in the meantime are the usual suspects: low morale, attrited supply lines, and attrited formations. None of these three has reached critical levels yet, and there is no 100% guarantee that any of them will, but time will tell. Now, a question on some people's minds might be, how does Wagner factor into this? The mercenary army led by Evgeny Prigozhin. Well, ever since their rebellion, Wagner troops have been mostly withdrawn from Ukraine. Some of them left Wagner and joined the Russian army instead, but many also stayed in Belarus as military trainers. Despite many Wagner soldiers staying to fight in Ukraine, I don't think they will represent much of a threat. The Wagner group was the strongest in its intact form with its well-established, experienced formations. Post-fracture, they won't influence the war as much, other than numerically bolstering some Russian formations. With all that in mind, let's take a look at how the counteroffensive is going. Most of the action is happening in the south of Ukraine, namely the Zaporozhye region. This is where the main effort is, and will be most likely. As I've said, here Russian lines are up to 50 kilometers deep, with multiple lines of defense. As of now, Ukrainians haven't even reached the first line. They're fighting in the contested zones before that, which is a 10 to 15 kilometer wide strip along the front line. They took over some trenches, but those aren't exactly the first line of defense, despite the cheerleaders' insistence. Here I'd like to emphasize again that we don't know what the actual Ukrainian battle plans are. We don't know what the Ukrainians want to accomplish in what time frame. Take those destroyed Bradleys and Leopards, which Russian state media photographed from every angle multiple times. We don't know what their task was, we have no idea. We can guess, we can even guess well, but that's the most we can do. Did Ukrainians plan on breaking through Russian lines quickly? Could be, maybe, likely, but we don't know. So far, Ukrainians only seem to be poking at Russian defense lines and exploiting the occasional openings. When Ukrainians detect a weak point, they reinforce the area, hoping to exacerbate the situation for Russians, potentially leading to a breakthrough. That is coupled with artillery barrages and supply line interdictions for greater effect. So far, we've only seen smaller progresses, mostly around Orikhiv and Velika Novosilka. However, Ukrainians also haven't stopped advancing around Bakhmut, aiming to envelop the city and force the Russians to abandon it. In fact, around Bakhmut, Russians have really been on the back foot lately. Current Ukrainian advances remain small, measured in villages, but even such small gains add up over time, and Ukraine still hasn't deployed the bulk of its counteroffensive forces. Clearly, they are waiting for a different opportunity. That being said, don't expect Crimea to be taken back this year, despite what some cheerleaders might say. It'll be difficult enough to cut the Russian land bridge to Crimea, let alone taking the peninsula itself. A more reasonable goal for the time being is the recapture of territories controlled before the 23rd of February. Once that comes within arm's reach, we can start talking about the Donbass and Crimea in terms of the counteroffensive. And here I'd also like to briefly mention Kherson. Some people might ask, now that the Nova Kakhovka dam has collapsed and the reservoir is drained, will this enable some sort of Ukrainian amphibious assault, for example on the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant? My answer is, I don't think so. Though the soil looks dry and cracked, underneath it's very much soft and moist. An armored vehicle would sink into that in no time. Aside from that, Ukrainians would have to cross a huge open space with a large river flowing through the middle. They would still need to cross a river, but this time without any cover on its banks. So I don't think Ukraine is seriously considering an amphibious assault at the moment. I should add, I could be wrong of course, but so far this seems unlikely. So what should we expect in the war going forward? It is my impression that Ukrainians went into the counteroffensive a bit too confident, but then after some equipment losses, they revised their strategy. This was the correct move compared to the Russian way of beating their head against the wall in Bakhmut and Vuhledar. We are still not in the main phase of the counteroffensive, the main forces haven't been deployed yet, and Ukrainians so far are only poking the Russian lines, looking for weaknesses and exploiting local opportunities. All this being said, even though progress might be slow, Russians can't just sit back and relax. They are taking significant losses, both personnel and equipment, the latter taken from a very much finite and fast-shrinking Soviet-era stockpile. To give you an idea, we have the bare minimum baseline of visually confirmed losses by Oryx, which was 15 tanks for the first week of the counteroffensive. The Ukrainian government's claim for destroyed Russian tanks, meanwhile, was 76. Of course, you should take the latter with a big grain of salt. Usually the truth is closer to the Oryx numbers. But then, on the 9th day of the counteroffensive, the 13th of June, Vladimir Putin stated that Russia has only lost 53 tanks compared to the hundreds of tanks and IFVs Ukraine has lost. Of course, that letter is ridiculous, but the former is very interesting. Putin's 53 figure is significantly closer to the Ukrainian government number than to the Oryx number. This potentially shows that a lot of losses go visually undocumented and that Russian losses are more severe than we thought. Recently, in visually confirmed losses, T-80 tanks started overtaking T-72 tanks, and the lost tanks are increasingly older, meaning Russia is slowly running out of T-72s and more modern tanks in general. Despite the West being frugal and somewhat reluctant with deliveries so far, given enough time, they can definitely outmatch Russian production and stockpiles. So the phrase, time is on Russia's side, is not necessarily accurate. Another point with regards to Western equipment. Going back to the failed Ukrainian push that saw the destruction and abandonment of multiple Bradleys and Leopards, keen-eyed viewers might notice an important detail. The vehicle's doors are open and there are no corpses around. Despite being hit by mines and artillery, it seems like the vehicles protected the soldiers who left the scene on their own. If this was a column of Russian-made vehicles, most of those soldiers would have been dead. Despite losses, Western equipment helps save soldiers' lives, thus preserving Ukraine's strength. The same cannot be said about the Russian military and their equipment. This is another factor in Ukraine's favor. Barring some major unforeseen event or events, I believe this is how the counteroffensive will chug along for a long time. Not as rapid, sweeping advances by either side, but as a slow, brutal attritional war where Ukraine slowly chips away at Russian-held territory. The question then becomes who breaks first or gets so exhausted they'll be forced to sit down at the negotiating table. Still, these are very much future considerations. The war will drag on well into next year, so first let's just get there and then we'll go from there. In the meantime, Russians continue being demons in human skin. As soon as they cancelled the grain agreement, they started bombarding Ukrainian grain storage facilities with grain meant for African countries. This was followed by hits on Kherson public transit, a missile strike on a residential block in Pokrovsk, and other choice war crimes. To those who have been paying attention to Russian military actions for a while now, this is nothing new. In Aleppo, Syria, they specifically targeted hospitals and razed half a dozen to the ground. In Ukraine, the modus operandi remains the same. If they have to rocket strike civilian energy infrastructure, hospitals and food storages, they will do so. If they have to launch thousands of cluster munitions indiscriminately on Ukrainian cities, then that's what they're going to do. For this reason, pay no attention to the hand-wringing and concern trolling of the quote-unquote peace activists who only started having problems with, say, cluster munitions once Ukraine got them. The same goes for the Kerch Bridge. Russia can spend months hammering Ukrainian civilian infrastructure with missiles, and we don't hear a peep from peace advocates. But once Ukraine hits the Kerch Bridge with a sea drone, well, how dare the Ukrainians target civilian infrastructure? Which the Kerch Bridge is not, by the way. It's a military logistics artery, therefore a legitimate target. If there are Russian civilians on the bridge, well, they are on Ukrainian territory on an unauthorized structure where the Ukrainian government forbade entry. If you still decide to go despite all this and get caught in an explosion, I don't know what to tell you. So when you encounter the aforementioned peace activists who seem to only ever have a problem with something when Ukraine does it, remember, for them it was never about peace or justice. They don't care, they never did, and they never will. Whether the peace advocate is on the far left or the far right, it doesn't matter. Their one and only consistent position is that they want Russia to win. Period. Now let's talk about how the war could theoretically end. It all depends on the situation on the battlefield, on which side can achieve what, in what time frame. I believe the current range of possibilities is between the full liberation of Ukraine on one hand and the North and South Korea situation on the other. The full liberation scenario is self-explanatory. Ukraine returns to its 1991 borders, with Donbass and Crimea returned to the country. As for the Korea scenario, that could mean something like the solidification of front lines and the cessation of hostilities held up by a 10-year ceasefire agreement. As a reminder, there is no real peace agreement between the two Koreas to this day. day. If this happens with Ukraine, the front lines turn into a type of demilitarized zone, the Ukrainian military gets fully outfitted with Western equipment, and then we'll go from there. I believe these are the two extremes currently on the table, but of course this might change with time. It all depends on a number of factors, many of which cannot be foreseen. But if Ukrainians figure out combined arms maneuvers at scale and are better able to break through Russian lines, this will increase the chances of the so-called good ending. In the meantime, you can also start playing Conflict of Nations, a free, online PvP strategy game in a world of modern, global warfare. Choose your strategy, engage in large-scale battles, and take over the world in the process. Get an exclusive gift of 13,000 gold and 1 month of premium subscription for free. The offer is available for 30 days only, so don't waste time. Click my link in the description, choose your country, and fight your way to victory. And now, as promised, here are some people you can and should follow if you want an accurate, unbiased coverage of the war in Ukraine. These would be Defmon, Tatarigami_UA, Michael Kaufman, Rob Lee, OSINT_East, OSINT Technical, Warmapper, and Special Herson Cat. Of course, this list isn't exhaustive. In contrast, here are some accounts to avoid at all costs if you want accurate coverage of the war in Ukraine. War Monitor, Trent Telenko, Igor Sushko, and Chuck Farrer. Once again, these are the ones you should avoid. Alright, so this was my Ukraine counteroffensive update, as of the first half of August. I hope you found it informative and enjoyable. I'll be putting out another Ukraine update next year at the earliest, unless something big happens. In the meantime, thank you for watching and see you next time.